And we are back on the Zero Hour. You know, obviously everybody is talking this week about the tragic Amtrak accident, and people are trying to make sense of it after the fact. It took place, that tragedy took place at the intersection of a lot of issues that are going on in American life right now. And here to talk about some of those is a man who is a labor musician, but also a railroad engineer, co-chair of Railroad Workers United, someone who I think will have some very good insights on this story and on the issues behind it. JP Wright, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Oh, you bet. And, you know, I thought of you guys, Railroad Workers United. We've had, you know, other members of the union on before. I thought of you guys and the work you do immediately when this accident took place. A number of issues came to mind, and I really want to get your thoughts on it. But one of the first questions that came to mind is that I've talked to members of your union about the whole one worker, one train situation where they expect a person to work an entire train all alone as an engineer. Was this, I guess there's a lot we could talk about, but JP, let's start with this. Do we know if this engineer was working alone?
I'm almost positive that he was. I've been scouring Twitter and, you know, checking the various news agencies, and if this worker wasn't working alone, which I'm pretty sure he was, that's a normal way of that Amtrak does operate. That the conductor, the person who will be in the back of the train, you know, working with the passengers, and then you do have a lone engineer in the front. I do know that happens on some of the trains like the California Zephyr and some of the other trains that Amtrak operates. I'm pretty sure that this was the way it's done.
And I can tell you, JP, that for what it's worth, on CNN last night, they had a safety expert on who did say flatly that he was working alone.
Yeah, and I was pretty sure he was. And, you know, something to know is that after the Lac-Mégantic accident in Canada, there was a big to-do, an investigative report done by the CBC of why did the last bullet point of their equivalent of the NTSB, why did they leave out the fact that the one-person train in Lac-Mégantic, was it a serious issue or not? Well, from that reporting, they did not even want to have that included in the government report. So, you know, this is the elephant in the room. Very much so, is that you've got a lone operator. With this case of this, it would only be speculation so far, but, you know, we know historically that the railroads they bully the government and communities, and they have a lot of power. And you've got this Federal Railway Administration, the actual government agency that's supposed to be regulating them, is being head up right now by an acting administrator who has no experience in the railroad industry. Couple that to a loan operator, couple that to the NTSB, that their only job really is to find fault. And unfortunately, they're going to approach this in that way. They're going to try to blame somebody. And luckily in this incident, we have an engineer who's alive, unlike we've got with some of these accidents, such as the Chatsworth accident in California that really started the whole Federal Railway Safety Act in 2008. But unfortunately, we're still talking about the same issues over and over and over again with this gigantic elephant in the room of a single operation of a train.
Yeah, and let's talk about that for a second, JP Wright. I mean, when we talk about somebody operating, basically piloting a train, responsible for the safety of, if it's a freight train, the cargo, and of course all the people at crossings and so on, as well as his or her own safety and so on. What are we? How long a shift are we talking about, for example?
12 hours.
12 hours. So 12 hours where a person has to sit straight. And this is talking about, you know, what about bathroom breaks? What about just sanity breaks? I mean, that is, I mean, to me, there's two sides of it. And I want to know your thoughts on it from the inside. One is, of course, the safety issue we've been talking about, which is, how can that possibly be safe? I mean, a person's got to go to the bathroom, a person's likely to get distracted, a person's likely to get tired. And then from the point of view of the engineer himself or herself, then it feels like some kind of science fiction dystopian thing. I mean, it just seems like that. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, well, especially think of it this way. We're taught from little children, from the time that we're a child, that anytime you do anything that's potentially dangerous, you're supposed to use the buddy system. We're taught that. So now we've got a rail industry that is trying to make the case that the computers are going to be our buddies. And the fact of the matter is that the computer is not going to know that there's a car on the track in front of them. The computer is not going to be able to physically get off of the train and go find out whether or not that this is a, the conductor, which is the person we're talking about here, is the pre-first responder. So there's been many situations where a conductor has gotten off of a train after a collision with a car and walked back there and held the person's hand until the EMS got there, or quite potentially saved their life, or was able to locate the people, and then the EMS shows up and takes care of the situation. But these trains, even the ones that don't carry hazmat materials, that's part of the conversation, an auto rack train coming out of, some industry that makes cars, these trains are over 7,200 feet sometimes. That's a mile and a half of a string of something that could quite potentially block an entire town or cut an entire town in half. And now have a major derailment where you've got fire equipment, emergency equipment, and you don't have a physical person on the train that's able to leave, get out, and go assess the situation and start quite possibly, cutting the train up over the crossings. That's the issues that we're not talking about because the public is so unaware of what's happening on the railroads. The questions that I get from the public about my job, they still think we're walking around in overalls with bandanas and pocket watches, when this has become a very, very computerized, very regulated industry where, it's not like it used to be or what people thought it was. And
we're talking with, let's talk about that computer thing for a second, JP. We're talking with JP Wright, who's co-chair of the Railroad Workers United Union and a labor musician. And we're talking about the Amtrak accident. I got a short rhetorical question about the idea that the computer would be the second person. And then I got a little bit of a longer question I want to explore with you on that, because that always sounds good to people. Well, there's a computer, that'll be the second head, and the guy needs to, take a bio break or do whatever he or she has to do. The computer will handle it, et cetera, et cetera. Number one, my retaurical question is, have you used Windows lately? If you think, you want to have human lives and the lives of property and safety of towns and so on dependent on a computer, that's number one. Number two, I guess, is the psychology of it all, that if a person really can be good at their job working this kind of eerie isolation for 12 hours at a time. But number three is, this is an interesting thing, because you mentioned the 2008 Railway is safe. I forget, the name, the Safety Act.
Yeah.
And we learned after this Amtrak accident that that act was passed, 7 years ago. They still, in one of the most heavily humanly traveled stretches of railroad, the Northeast Corridor, Amtrak, they still don't have the computer system installed in some of these highly populated stretches like around Philadelphia. They still don't have, for that matter, the track is antiquated. But it seems like if you're going to tell me that the computers are going to replace the humans, shouldn't you have the computers working first?
Well, I did an interview with the International Business Times recently, and the first thing I said to the interviewer when he asked me some questions was, hey, it's a brave new world. And unfortunately, that's where we are. If you know that's from the book by Aldous Huxley. I can't say that name right. But
you did fine.
So that's what we got. Now, for me, somebody who is a nerd, I love computers. I've built them. I love systems. I love the possibility that we are going to be more efficient using computers. I think that's a good idea. But whenever we are using computers to physically replace human beings, we definitely have to make sure that the people that are behind that, especially in a profit-driven model such as a corporation, that they are being held accountable for how they are using this new technology. Now, we have a Federal Railway Administration that is able to be the federal body that regulates the railroads. But if we're in a situation now where the Federal Railway Administration is being head up by an acting person who doesn't even have any, experience in the railroad industry, well, if we've got the National Transportation Safety Board that's going to be trying to find fault here, who appointed those people to those governing bodies and regulatory bodies? Now, I, as a worker and co-chair of Railroad Workers United, can speak in a very interesting position because Railroad Workers United is not the union that represents the workers. We are just a group of railroad workers from all across the United States that have come together to, mutually aid each other in various ways. Sort of different, like an alternative labor group. That's kind of what we are. So we can speak critically of how the union is approaching this, but we can also speak very, very, from a very unapologetic position about the governance and the regulatory, and we can also speak very eloquently about our specific position at work. It's kind of like this. When we want to talk about teachers, you always notice that they want to demonize the teachers and say these are the people who are at fault, even though these are also the people that have master's degree in their profession. Why wouldn't you want to speak to that person? Well, they discredit that person because that person is too embedded or whatever. Well, it's kind of idiotic to say that in a lot of ways. I'm a person who has been driving trains for 8 years every single day. I think I know basically what is the problem here.
Right.
Well, the unions.
Yeah.
You've got the unions, the government, the industry, the corporations all fighting, and the people and the workers don't have a say. Unfortunately, that's where we're at.
Well, and the parallel with teachers is an interesting one, JP, right? Because, the teachers, they put them in a classroom with 40, 45 kids in communities that are impoverished, in schools that don't have budgets for pencils and paper and textbooks. And then they expect that lone teacher in a classroom of 45 kids in a problematic situation without any tools to conduct her trade to somehow do his or her job miraculously. And when they don't, they demonize them so that the public won't look at the underlying issues involved, and they sort of praise them as if market forces or something are going to fix it. It seems to me that lone teacher in front of a classroom of 40 kids is a lot like that lone engineer, driving 1.5 miles a train without any backup or support. So, I love that you made that analogy. And I guess in terms of, as we learn more about the Amtrak accident, I think it's good. I think the demonization of the engineer has already begun. I think it's important that you guys and others should keep the conversation focused on the systematic issues that are involved. So I love that you guys.
Because look how we are dealing with each of these issues when a black person is killed. The very first thing the media starts to do in some ways is to try to find fault. Well, each individual, there's hundreds of reasons why that specific incident may have happened. But here we are, and you just said it a minute ago with the analogy that I made with teachers. It's the same thing. They're trying to find out why did this engineer go around a curve at 100 miles an hour. Well, that's a big question. And it involves a lot more than just that engineer.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that, JP. Do you think he was, in terms of the speed issue, do you think they were leaning on him to make up time, or any thoughts on what that might have been about?
Well, we'd be talking about Casey Jones, right? But
yeah, absolutely.
But, historically speaking, no, probably not, because there are certain speed restrictions that, an engineer these days, we don't do that. That's not part of the equation anymore. because the freight railroads are also involved. And the freight railroads are putting a lot of pressure on Amtrak. They don't want Amtrak on their tracks. They don't want to also have to be held accountable when the Amtrak fails. So, no, but I can tell you what, my speculation would be, and it would be absolute speculation, that there may have been some fatigue issues involved. If you think about speeds of 60 miles an hour, we all know that 5280 is a mile. Well, if he only had 2 miles to make a decision to change his speed, or if he was suffering from occupational fatigue, which there's a thing called micro-napping, where you daydream, you could potentially suffer from micro-napping, where your eyes are open, but you're actually dreaming and you're not aware of your surroundings. That can happen for 15 to 45 seconds. So if you're traveling at a speed of 60 miles an hour, and we know that the decision-making has to be made within 2 miles, you start doing the equations and the math, you figure out you don't have a lot of time to reduce speeds of 70 miles an hour down to 50 or 25 now. And how long would it take an Amtrak locomotive to speed up to 100 miles an hour? Now, that's absolute speculation about that specific situation, but there are very many other situations that are just like that.
And here's what's not speculation, JP Wright, which is that from what I've heard, but you correct me if I'm wrong, the computer systems that would have overridden that and first of all given him a warning and then cut down that speed if he didn't cut down, they were mandated in 2008 by law, and they weren't even scheduled to be installed till 2017 or something, 9 years after the law was passed. Now, that's a budgetary issue. That's not an engineer mistake, right?
Exactly. And here's the other problem. Not only has that been the case, but the railroads have been allowed to move forward with fuel conservation technology that very much is very close to this positive train control that they have been pushing back. The date was 2012 for full implementation on freight railroads. Well, they've pushed that back and requested that to be pushed. Because,
and then we get it. And unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap up soon, but because I'm learning a lot about this. But then we get into the issue of the tracks and the fact that the slower speed is because of the degraded quality of the tracks that we're not replacing, and that's an infrastructure problem, and on and on and on. So I wish we had more time to talk about this. And I just want to say briefly, JP, before we go, since you're not just co-chair of Railroad Workers United, you're also a labor musician. I think we're going to have you back on to talk about music, because I have a music background too. I just did my first gig in a long, long time a couple of weeks ago. So we got to talk about that sometime too.
Yeah, and if you're interested in my music right now is a good time, because I just got off the Joe Hill tour. I just did a 8-city tour, and it's all being blogged and posted at railroadmusic.org. So my website is railroadmusic.org.
And your website for the music is railroadmusic.org. I love railroad music. Yeah. And the website for the for Railroad Workers United?
Yeah, that's Railroad Workers United, and that's with an S, railroadworkersunited.org. Yeah, we've
all right. We'll check that out too. And unfortunately,
for sure.
Yeah, unfortunately, we got a lot to talk about, so we'll have you back. JP Wright, co-chair of Railroad Workers United, labor musician. Thanks so much for joining us on the Zero Hour.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Take care.
You bet. We'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour.